Welcome here, my dear friend. Before we get to your very interesting analysis on the Memorandum of Understanding, this morning the Russian military shot down over 400 drones in the suburbs of Moscow and including at Moscow International Airport, into and out of which I have flown several times. Does Russia have any red lines?
Well, thanks for having me back on, Judge. I think what we're seeing here is a war that has devolved into a war that, as we've been characterizing it for years now, a war that Russia can't lose and Ukraine can't win. And of course, if you apply that logic, the inverse is often true as well. And so this is a war that has become, I think, what many of us were concerned about it becoming. I'm sure if we rewound the tape, this is what we were saying back in 2023 and 2022, this idea that this would devolve into essentially a war of the cities, something similar to what we saw with the Iran-Iraq war, where neither side can end the war unless there's some type of external actor, some type of force majeure, some type of deus ex machina, something, act of God that is unforeseen or uncontrollable. So in terms of the Russians and the red lines, I don't really think they do, Judge. I mean, certainly the political pressure on Vladimir Putin is great. Say what you will about whether these drone strikes, this campaign is effective. The perception is there, not just the perception in the West that Ukraine is now winning the war, which they're not, but it does give a whole real boost of confidence to the Europeans. And it certainly gives confidence to Americans who want the United States to get back into this. But for the Russians as well, though, too, just the reality of the war going this way, an inability to win a war against Ukraine. And I think the refrain you hear a lot from Russians is, it only took us 4 years to beat the Nazis, and here we are 4.5 years with the Ukrainians. This idea that the Russians have to do something more, have to do something else, have to really hit hard here, whether it be in Ukraine or, God forbid, extended outside of Ukraine, so the horizontal escalation of this war. But I don't think the Russians have red lines per se, but I think the pressure that is being put on them only leads to one direction, because if anyone thinks that this drone campaign, again, and we can go back and forth whether it's effective or not, is going to have any influence on them other than to escalate in response, I don't know what to tell you. And those in Ukraine, those in Europe, those in the U.S. who believe this drone campaign is going to lead to a weakening of Russian resolve, they're just, they're high on their own gaslighting, as my friend Rich says.
Right. But the pressure on Vladimir Putin has to be extraordinary.
Yeah.
For example, do you think he is considering attacking munitions plants in Western Europe that make the parts for these drones?
I don't think so, Judge. I just don't see the Russians escalating it that way. That would give them the war with NATO that they started this war in Ukraine to supposedly avoid. So I just don't think, watching the Russians over these years, seeing how they act, seeing how they carry out their strategy to achieve their political objectives, I don't see them as lashing out in that way in an effort to escalate to de-escalate. There's a misconception in the West that the Russians have an escalate to de-escalate policy. I'm sure Scott Ritter can talk about this much greater than I can, but that really, my understanding, is the misconception. The Russians don't possess that policy. But certainly I think what you'll see is a much harder hitting of Ukraine. What we've seen, Judge, say over the last 4.5 years is a Russia that really has had the dial set at, say, a 5 or a 6 out of 10 in terms of how hard they've been hitting Ukraine. And you've heard this commentary, you've heard this criticism quite a bit coming out of Russia. We're not fighting hard enough. We're not doing enough. Why are the trains still running? Why is Zelensky's government buildings, or why are they still standing? Why are these headquarters that are buried underground that supposedly our Oreshniks can destroy, how come they're still operating?
What is the answer to all those why questions, Matt?
That's a really good question, Judge. I think the Russians, we here in the West, we have a method of warfare that we view as righteous, but when you look at how we actually conduct it, it's barbaric. even World War II say the war crimes that we were committed in are defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, massive. And the generals who carried out those atrocities fully recognized it and they understood it. And that's why they created things such as the United Nations and modern international law, the modern Geneva Conventions, in order to prevent those atrocities from happening again, because they understood where modern war took you. But certainly you look at Korea, you look at Vietnam, we were not as robust in our killing in Afghanistan and Iraq, but certainly we killed millions in our wars in the Middle East, millions in our wars in the Muslim world. If you look at, say, Judge, the conduct of our five and a half week long air campaign against Iran in March and April, I think we launched 21,000 sorties.
Wow.
21,000 targets were attacked, essentially, say. And out of that, less than 1/3, according to Bloomberg, were actually military targets. The rest were civilian targets, infrastructure, or government buildings. In the West, we have this idea, and then certainly Israel, the paradigm of Western warfare, I think, but certainly, you look at the way the Iranians have conducted their warfare. You look at the way that the Russians have conducted their warfare. They are not actively seeking civilian targets. They are not actively trying to kill civilians. Certainly, they will hit infrastructure that will pressure the civilian side and make so the Russian attacks on energy infrastructure have made life miserable in Ukraine for 4 winters now. But they're not striking residential buildings in the same way that the United States and Israel attack residential buildings. Sure, residential buildings get hit often because of errant missiles, because of drones that go out of control, because of just the nature of warfare. But the Russians have carried out a type of warfare that has been restricted, and they use that term special military operation. And I scoff at that, like I also scoff at the idea of having to call the Iraq War Operation Iraqi Freedom. But I think with the Russians, there is this idea that this was supposed to be a limited war, that this was a war that was meant for limited objectives to secure the Russian-speaking territory in eastern Ukraine, say, as well as to preclude further NATO encroachment, further provocation, further threats against the Russian state. So this special military operation was carried out. Now, 4.5 years in, the calls to remove those limitations, to take the gloves off and to hit hard, to engage in a warfare similar to how the Americans and the Israelis carry out their warfare. It's been said for years now in Russia, but now as we're seeing this point where the Ukrainians, to their credit, have gotten this ability. And yes, the Europeans are heavily involved in the drone campaign, as well as the Americans, because where is this targeting information coming from? Where are the Ukrainians getting their intelligence? But certainly this reality that the Russians are now enduring is a reality that was predictable. Where else was this war was going to go? If you weren't going to end the war, either by winning it or by negotiating, where did people think this war was going to go?
How is it going to end? It's not going to end in a conference room, is it?
No, Judge. I mean, I'm worried that this war muddles along, and I know that's a pretty poor choice of words for the death and destruction we're talking about here, the savagery and the harm, the suffering, but muddling along for another several years. I mean, I just don't see how it ends. I don't see either side losing their will. The best case I would think I would say over the last several years, I thought the way the war might end outside of a negotiated settlement would have been through economic collapse, through government collapse on the Ukrainian side. But now it seems as if the Europeans have developed the ability to ensure that the house of cards, that is the Ukrainian government, remains upright, that they've been able to create the political order to ensure that Ukraine is going to get loans, that Ukraine is going to get grants, that Ukraine is going to get money for its coffers, even if the United States is no longer providing such money. And so, of course, now that we're in 2026, or halfway through 2026, we see the United States Congress trying to pass bills to send more money to Ukraine. The thoughts the Democrats might take the House of Representatives, maybe even the Senate, inspire this confidence in Europe and in Ukraine that the light is at the end of the tunnel. And that if after 2028 in January 2029, we have a Gavin Newsom or a Gretchen Whitmer or someone along those lines in the White House, that the United States will come back into the conflict. So I really don't see how this conflict ends. I think the Russian plan to finalize their conquest of the Donbass, to achieve their territorial limitations, and then possibly enter into a frozen conflict, I don't see the Europeans and the Ukrainians going along with that, nor will the Americans. And that if the Russians are successful in their territorial conquest, I think what you're going to have for NATO is this is NATO's purpose, as it has been for the last several years, and that the Donbass is now the new Jerusalem. And the idea of taking back the Donbass from Russia will animate the Europeans and many Americans for decades to come, maybe. And this idea that this war continuing in some form or another, but including continuing to move into this war of cities, because the next thing for the Ukrainians, Judge, and you hear this and you see this in the op-ed pages, this is not any brilliant insight of mine or anything like that, is this idea that the Ukrainians need to get ballistic missiles, right? And the Ukrainians will get ballistic missiles. In a year or two's time, they will have some form of ballistic missile that may or may not be as effective as the Russian ones, but will still be as difficult to shoot down, just because of the reality of how ballistic missiles work and how hard they are to defend against them. So, I mean, I'm afraid, Judge, that this thing continues to, again, muddle along for years to come, unless there is some type of black swan event, some force majeure, something unforeseen, some deus ex machina, right? You pick the term you want, that provides for an outside force, an outside actor, something unforeseen to change this war, because I don't see either side losing their political will. And again, what I thought might be likely a collapse of the Ukrainian government because of, a bankruptcy, just say, that seems less likely than it's ever been, because of the commitment to Europe and the hope that the United States is going to come back in the war. And now, I mean, certainly Ukraine has manpower problems. We can go through the whole list of all this, but what's the European Union doing? They're going to send back all the military age males, all the Ukrainian military age males that are refugees or
that escaped. Right. Let me switch gears. I guess the reality of defeat in Iran has sunk in. I mean, the Strait of Hormuz is in Iranian control, and the United States and the Israelis are not fighting Iran anymore.
Right.
So,
I mean, oh, go ahead.
I mean, where does it go from here? To quote what you said recently, is this peace or is it a pause?
Right. And I think what you're going to see, Judge, is this idea that a modus vivendi, we've talked about this for months now, right? But this kind of just this hot ceasefire, this accommodation, this way of going along and getting along, as long as the commercial ships continue to see an uptick. And you're going to have these top periods where the Iranians are upset and they shut down the Straits of Hormuz, because the Iranians have control of the Straits of Hormuz, and there's nothing anyone can do about that. And so I think what you'll see is this status quo that we have seen essentially continue to develop, and the back and forth with the negotiations will continue. And I think this will go on through the elections. And then after the elections, I think Donald Trump has to make a determination as to whether this war is going to be his legacy, this peace, as he can sell it as a peace, as he can sell it as a victory, as he can sell it as the only president in 47 years to stand up to the Ayatollah, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then Donald Trump has to make a decision whether or not he wants that as his legacy, or he wants to go back to war for what purposes. If you couldn't accomplish in March and April what you set out militarily, why would you be able to accomplish it in December? But
is the
so be it.
Military starting to bring heavy equipment like jet fighters home?
That's my understanding. That they have rotated some of those units back. They can always bring them back to the Middle East, but that's my understanding, Judge, is that some of those aircraft, some of those fighter squadrons have begun to rotate back, or have been rotating back to the U.S. And we're seeing reports. One was in the Wall Street Journal, but I think this is what most folks have been thinking about for the last couple of months, is that the United States and its Gulf Arab allies, or vassals, I guess you could call them, might be better, are revisiting how the American force structure in the Middle East is going to look like. What's the American footprint going to look like? And certainly the idea that the Americans would reinforce their presence or expand their presence in Israel, particularly, as we see Section 224, the proposed amendment for the National Defense Authorization Act,
Right.
as we see that trying to integrate the American and the Israeli militaries, that makes sense.
Military and intelligence.
And intelligence and technology and industry. I mean, I think basically what you have, the entire American military industrial complex looking no different than Congress does when it comes to the Israel lobby. And the real danger on this, just if people aren't sure how it's going to work, is this proposal. And there's also 3 or 4 other bills involved here that, as you said, Judge, would expand it to intelligence into other areas, this integration. I mean, the danger, of course, is that, you can vote every year on giving money to Israel. You can take away that money, but this integration is permanent. So that's one danger. And the other danger is that this creates essentially an unheard of position within the Department of Defense, this executive agent, essentially a czar, someone who would be responsible for all things Israel within the Pentagon. And that this person would have the power to override essentially anyone in the Pentagon, any institution, any agency, any branch.
Including the Secretary of Defense?
I would assume that person would be loyal to the Secretary of Defense because that's who would have appointed him. But conceivably, this executive agent would have that authority to override all other decisions pertaining to Israel, whatever is in his or her purview.
All right, I want to ask you about Netanyahu and what you think he's up to. But before I do, I want you to watch this little clip, Chris, where Netanyahu actually says Israel will expand from the river to the sea.
Much more. I think there are many principles. I'll give you another example, another principle of the government I intend, the broad national government I intend to lead. There is no place for 2 states. What, from the sea to the Jordan, there is no room for 2 states.
What is he up to?
Oh, he's carrying out the Greater Israel Project, Judge.
Isn't the Greater Israel Project now a failure? Hasn't it collapsed after the memorandum of understanding?
No, I mean, the Israelis have gotten the Secretary of State of the United States to create a separate peace between Israel and Lebanon, which essentially is a abscondation of Lebanon's sovereignty. But this peace agreement with Israel and Lebanon put forward, carried out, executed by the Secretary of State directly undermines, it contradicts what the president was doing with memorandum of understanding. Correct. So the Israel lobby, right, has gotten this schism within the administration between, you can put it simply, between the vice president and the Secretary of State. This, of course, is a foretelling or a foreshadowing of 2028. But this just shows you how these people are not going to give up, and they're very resourceful, very, very effective. Israel, Judge, we had here in Raleigh last night, a friend of mine was in from Palestine, a man named Iyad Bernat, and he's in a village in Berlin, which is where the apartheid wall runs right through. And in their village, Judge, of roughly 3,000 people, 36 children are still being held captive in Israeli prisons. You just had Bezalel Smotrich declare, following the IDF, saying that they now have 70% control of Gaza. Bezalel Smotrich just yesterday or the day before said, we have plans for 3 settlements in Gaza.
We actually have that clip. It's a little stomach churning, but
yeah,
here he is.
Samaria is the mountain that geographically and topographically dominates all these areas. And if we are not there, God forbid, Hamas will end up taking over in a second. We saw how quickly they took over Gaza. In the end, when we establish 103 settlements and 160 farms, pave roads, plan and regulate, our goal is to bring 1 million settlers to Judea and Samaria so that there won't be pickup trucks later in Ra'anana, Kfar Saba, Petah Tikva, Tel Aviv, Be'er Sheva, and Afula. And that's true? God forbid.
Hamas took over Gaza. I guess he forgets there was a popular election.
Right, and as well as to his own prime minister ensuring that Hamas had the money from the Qataris to stay in power for all those
Correct.
years.
Correct.
So he's talking there with his 103 farms and 150 settlements or whatever he says there about the West Bank and adding another million settlers to the
Right.
nearly 1 million settlers that are already there. But he also said, Judge, with regards to Gaza, that there are plans to put settlements into Gaza. And you now have the IDF saying we control 70% of Gaza.
What happened to the Board of Peace and
the Board
Tony
of Peace?
Blair is the Governor General of Gaza.
Right. Where's Tony Blair? How come Tony Blair's not regulating all this? Because Tony Blair's taking home his whatever he's getting paid for this more than you and I are getting paid. That's for sure. Right. But certainly that farce that is the Board of Peace has enabled Israel to carry out that consolidation of its victory in Gaza. So whereas when the Board of Peace was established, go back to October in this peace deal, Israel controlled roughly 53% of Gaza. They now control 70% of Gaza, and they have made clear it will be 100%. They are continuing to push their efforts to voluntarily migrate, put that term in quotes. In fact, they've actually changed the name. They're no longer calling it voluntary migration. They're now calling it freedom of movement. To try and make it more appealing.
George Orwell triumphant. Matt, I have to go. Thank you very much. I'm off for a couple of weeks. We'll look forward to seeing you in the middle of July.
Absolutely. Have a wonderful vacation, Judge. You too, Chris, and everybody have a safe and happy holiday here in the U.S.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. All the best. If you're watching us live in 36 minutes at 3 o'clock on all of this, Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski, Judge Napolitano for judging.